Imagine waking to a world whose certainties have thinned, where the laws you trusted now look like sketches, and something deeper calls from beneath the facts. Tonight we step beyond instruments and equations into a region where truth lives as meaning, and the soul becomes the last laboratory. Science offers us a mirror polished by measurement. In that mirror we see the world pared down to relations, formulas, and repeatable events. We see motion reduced to calculus, flame to thermodynamics, consciousness mapped to neural circuits. In this mirror we have learned to read the handwriting of nature. The stars obey gravity, molecules obey chemistry, cells obey evolutionary histories. And yet, for all its brilliance, the mirror reveals only surfaces lit by a very particular light, the light of quantification. It registers shape and movement, frequency and pattern, but it does not translate longing into meaning, does not render the whisper of a dream into any figure that instruments can hold. There is a shadow at the edge of the mirror. That shadow is not error so much as absence. The absence of the inner landscape that makes outer facts matter. To speak plainly, knowledge of how does not guarantee knowledge of why. We can describe the synapse and still be stumped by the question of why an idea moves a human to sacrifice, why a piece of music can cause a grown man to weep, or why a single sentence can alter an entire life's trajectory. The scientist's tools are exquisite at shaping our understanding of the external mechanics of existence. They are terrible, however, as translators of meaning, and because meaning is the currency of lived life, the fact that the mirror excludes it becomes a moral and existential problem. We live inside stories, we act within narratives. If our measurements do not account for story, they will, by design, misrepresent the way humans encounter reality. This is not to denigrate science. Far from it. It is to insist on humility, that the scientific method is one of many modes of knowing, not the only one. There is a romance of reductionism, the dream that if we break the world down far enough, we will hold the whole in our hand. But the whole we seek is not merely the sum of parts, it is also their arrangement in a context of human meaning. The river that flows past the village is not only H2O in motion, it is the place where children learn to love, where crops were sown, where treaties were signed. The scientist can map the river's bend and velocity, but to map the way it holds memory and promise requires other instruments: narrative, ritual, symbol. When the man of measurement neglects the man of meaning, a profound imbalance emerges. Societies can become technologically adept while emotionally anesthetized. They can achieve mastery over matter while losing the grace of inner life. As a result, we encounter modern maladies of soul, boredom masked as entertainment, despair wearing the robe of efficiency, and a hunger for value that no algorithm can satisfy. The question we must ask is not whether science is true. It clearly is, but whether it can be the final arbiter of human worth. My assertion is modest. Science must be integrated with an understanding of meaning, not allowed to colonize it. Practically, this call implies new disciplines and a new humility for old ones. We must build a hermeneutic that takes laboratory findings and asks, again and again, what they signify for lived human experience. A discovery that changes the genome must be measured for its effects not only on disease curves, but on identity, on family narratives, on the metaphors that give life shape. A new device that extends life must be judged not only for its technological efficacy, but for how it changes the story we tell about mortality and continuity. In short, we need an ethics of meaning. To move beyond the mirror is to learn to listen to the shadow. It means attending to the ways people describe their lives in images and dreams. It means recognizing that human beings do not merely compute incentives. They are moved by myth. And when scientific discourse forgets myth, it forgets an essential vector of human cohesion. The modern age boasts unprecedented knowledge of the external world. It is time to cultivate a complementary depth. an interior science that studies the dynamics of symbol, myth, and subjective truth. Only then will our mirror reflect not merely the world as a machine, but the world as a theater of meaning, worthy of our full human attention. Symbols are not decorative extras, they are structural vessels in which psyche stores experience. Across cultures and ages, humans have spoken to the world through images: the tree that stands for life, the cave that hides the unknown, water that carries transformation. These images recur not because of accident, but because they sit in the collective field of human meaning, archetypal gestures that shape perception and behavior in subtle, yet profound ways. Dreams, in the same register, are not random noise. They are the mind's metaphorical laboratory, where conflicts, hopes, and unspoken truths take on shape. A dream of falling may be a neurochemical fluster, but it can also be a staged reenactment of a principal anxiety about failing identity. To dismiss such imagery as mere epiphenomenon is to lose a map for the interior territory. The modern scientist often approaches symbol with suspicion. Symbols are messy, slippery, and refuse to be converted into neat variables. Yet to discard them is to discard a form of cognitive economy evolved over millennia, a communal shorthand that allows cultures to teach, remember, and reorganize. When a civilization loses its symbolic fluency, it becomes trapped in literalism. Everything must be stated, nothing allowed to hint. Such cultures become brittle, because nuance is their ally, and nuance is precisely what literal thinking scorns. If we are to build a truly expansive discourse, we must relearn the grammar of images. A dream speak in paradox, and paradox often carries the wholeness that linear thinking cannot grasp. A patient who complains of a hole in the chest is not merely giving a poetic complaint, she is identifying a felt absence that maps onto social and historical losses. A nation that dreams of floods may be processing displacement and insecurity in a way statistics cannot capture. Thus, professionals of all kinds, physicians, educators, policymakers, must become attentive to symbolic meanings that either support or thwart recovery and growth. Furthermore, symbols are generative. They do not merely reflect, they create. The images that dominate a culture, expansion, control, consumption, or reciprocity, restraint, and reverence, shape the policies it enacts and the instruments it legitimizes. A society steeped in images of conquest will prize technologies that exploit. One shaped by images of care will invest differently. Thus, the study of symbol becomes not a luxury of poets, but a necessity of public life. We must study the metaphorical substrates of decision, making as carefully as we study empirical substrates. In practical terms, this agenda calls for an interdisciplinary restoration. Anthropology, psychology, literary studies, and the humanities must collaborate with the sciences. Our educational systems should teach not only how to run experiments, but how to read a myth as a map of psychic economy. Corporations must be asked not only how profitable their products are, but what images those products propagate. In other words, the language of symbol must be mainstreamed into the language of consequence. Until then, we will continue to build brilliant technologies without fully apprehending the psychic ecosystems into which they are released. The assumption of naive realism is that the world is out there and that we passively perceive it. Yet growing lines of thought suggest a deeper reciprocation, that our consciousness participates in, and in certain respects brings forth, the reality we describe. Consciousness is not simply a mirror reflecting neurons. It is a workshop in which perception, intention, and attention weave the tapestry we call the world. Consider the simple act of reading. When you read a line of poetry, the inked letters become an event of meaning inside you. The letters remain inked letters outside you, but the poem is a process that requires your interior participation. Multiply this participatory act across the whole of perception, and the outline of a startling thesis emerges. To be conscious is to be a co-creator of what is observed. This is not mysticism without consequence. The effect of observation upon recorded phenomena in physics has practical implications in other domains of inquiry. The observer, the person who measures names and selects, introduces variables that must be accounted for. In social science, the presence of a researcher changes behavior. In medicine, a patient's belief in a treatment alters its efficacy. In everyday life, shared attention to a symbol can make the symbol's power real in the social field. A consciousness, it turns out, is not a passive register, it is an active principle. Recognizing consciousness as an architect does not dissolve objectivity, it complicates it sensibly. It means that we must develop methods that are reflexive, methods that account for the role of the observer, and that treat subjectivity as legitimate data. Qualitative methods. First, person reports, phenomenological accounts. These must be taken with the same seriousness as controlled trials, not as mere anecdotes. The inner life cannot be bracketed away as noise. It is a signal, one that carries information about values, meanings, and trajectories that shape measurable outcomes. Moreover, consciousness has layers. There is personal consciousness, our felt present awareness, and there is a field of relational consciousness that emerges when people interact. There is also the deeper substrate, collective and ancestral, which shapes motifs, predispositions, and recurring images across cultures. It is in this stratified architecture that change occurs. Moments of individual awakening can ripple into cultural shifts when they find resonance in collective forms. A new way of seeing, an innovation in consciousness, can alter markets, laws, and institutions because it subtly changes what a community attends to, values, and remembers. For those who practice science, and those who live by science, this realization demands ethical and methodological adjustments. Scientists must be trained to ask not only, what happens, but who is attending to what, and why does that attention matter? Clinicians must include narrative and first-person testimony as integral parts of diagnosis. Educators must cultivate capacities of reflection that enable students to be aware of their own participatory role in knowledge production. Such an orientation will not replace rigorous empiricism, it will enrich it, rendering scientific practice more humane, more responsive, and more truthful to the lived condition. Finally, honoring consciousness as an architect invites a profound shift in responsibility. If our attention creates the world we inhabit, then ethical attention becomes a practice of world-making. To attend with cruelty is to amplify systems of harm. To attend with care is to generate conditions of healing. The task before us is thus not merely cognitive, but moral. How shall we deploy the creative power of awareness to shape a future that honors complexity, dignity, and depth? Modern physics, in its most disquieting findings, returns us to ancient intuitions that the act of observation alters the observed, that what was assumed separate is entangled, that particles and waves are not stable properties, but relational events. The quantum paradox, where measurement affects state, forces us to reconsider long-standing metaphysical categories. If elementary phenomena do not have determinate attributes independent of observation, then the wall dividing subject and object is porous. The implications for our existential self-understanding are profound. The inner observer is not merely a philosophical abstraction in this context. It is a factor that must be treated with methodological respect. To the extent that observation participates in manifestation at the quantum scale, the idea that consciousness is epiphenomenal becomes less tenable. Instead, the inner observer appears as a subtle field in which possibilities collapse into actualities. If we take this seriously, not as mystical speculation, but as disciplined implication, then our scientific languages must broaden. We must ask whether the models that assume a rigid separation between measurer and measured are simply inadequate for capturing reality at its foundational levels. This line of thinking does not grant carte blanche to wishful thinking. The operational success of physics remains undeniable. The technologies built on quantum mechanics function as predicted. Yet beneath the predictive power, we must not ignore the metaphysical lesson. The cosmos may be a participatory system. Further, this participation is not a mere exotic feature of atoms. It may scale into human domains in ways that matter. The way an experiment is framed, the assumptions the researcher brings, the narrative promises that surround a finding, all these shape what becomes salient and what remains invisible. A careful integration requires new vocabularies and experiments designed to probe the boundary between inner stance and outer measurement. It suggests that studies of perception, attention, and intention could become more central to fundamental inquiry. If conscious intention can shape physical systems at subtle thresholds, then controlled studies, replicable protocols, and rigorous statistical designs must be marshaled to adjudicate these claims. To say this is not to conclude a particular metaphysical thesis. It is to call for disciplined curiosity. Ultimately, what the quantum paradox offers us is a mirror that reflects our procedures and presuppositions back upon us. It teaches epistemic modesty. It instructs that reality may not be a fixed repository, but an ongoing conversation among levels of being. The inner observer, then, is not a passive witness but a participating voice. The mode of science that learns to listen to that voice, without abandoning rigor, will open doors we have long treated as sealed. Objectivity, as commonly understood, is a noble aspiration, knowledge that transcends personal bias and stands independently of who investigates it. It is the ideal that has made modern science possible. But objectivity is also fragile, because it is built on a set of cultural assumptions that themselves require scrutiny. The illusion arises when we forget that objectivity was crafted by beings with histories, languages, and drives. We then mistake our cultural protocols for cosmic mandates. Historically, every major advancement in thought has required a redefinition of what counts as objective. The Copernican revolution, the advent of evolution, the discovery of the unconscious, all these forced us to reframe the conditions under which assertions about the world were acceptable. Each time, some formerly incontestable truth became a perspective among perspectives. The lesson is sobering. What we now call objective might later be recognized as parochial. Therefore, we must treat objectivity as a provisional achievement, not as an absolute monolith. This humility has practical implications. Researchers should make explicit their theoretical commitments, their funding sources, their cultural presuppositions, and their selection criteria. Journals should demand reflexive statements as a norm. Educational institutions should teach the history and sociology of knowledge so that scientists understand their own embeddedness. These measures do not weaken science. They strengthen it by making claims more transparent and by reducing the chance that unconscious biases will masquerade as neutral facts. Moreover, rethinking objectivity opens space for acknowledging forms of knowledge that were previously sidelined: indigenous ways of knowing, embodied practices, narratives of lived experience. These sources often possess constraints and validation, procedures that differ from lab protocols, but are nonetheless robust within their domains. A pluralistic epistemology does not dissolve standards. It enlarges the arena of testable and actionable insight. It allows us to ask better questions and to design interventions more attuned to human complexity. Finally, the fragility of objectivity is a spiritual challenge. We who venerate evidence must also cultivate doubt. Doubt here is not cynicism, it is attentional virtue. It enables us to hold competing hypotheses in temperate tension and to value the humility that keeps inquiry honest. We progress not by bulldozing doubt, but by sheltering it within structures of disciplined curiosity. In doing so, we convert the fragile illusion into a resilient practice. If we examine the long arcs of history, A pattern recurs. Civilizations build astonishingly precise external orders. Then those orders ossify. Entropy brings crisis. Renewal emerges, sometimes in radical, unexpected forms. This is not merely cyclical happenstance, but an expression of a deeper principle. When societies invest in the outer ways of knowing while neglecting inner cultivation, they accumulate a kind of spiritual debt. The public institutions remain functional for a time, but the deficit of meaning grows until it demands repayment in forms that are often painful. The great empires were not failed because of poor metrics. Rather, they failed because their myths lost resonant meaning for the people they governed. The architects of cities, the engineers of roads, the custodians of law, these can operate excellently while the communal story fades. When the language that binds a culture weakens, the institutions begin to wobble. The historical lesson is instructive for our present moment. Technological prowess alone cannot secure flourishing indefinitely. Rebirth often arrives from the margins. Artists, wise elders, prophetic voices, or small communities that preserve an alternately gleaming thread of meaning. These are the seedbeds of transformation. A culture's future depends not only on its data and devices, but on the vitality of its inner, preserving practices. Rituals of care, practices of attention, modes of storytelling that reinscribe value. History thus seems to offer a redemptive loop. Collapse can be the fertile ground for a more integrated way of living that learns from previous hubris. For those engaged in contemporary design and policy, this historical pattern is a warning and a mandate. Infrastructure planning, education reform, technological development, all must attend to the invisible architecture of meaning. Long-term viability requires that we embed systems with rites of renewal, cultural practices that replenish attention, institutions that honor narrative continuity, and communal commitments that preserve symbolic fluency. Without these, any material success remains provisional, liable to be undermined by the very human needs that machines cannot fulfill. Humans do not exist in isolation. We inhabit collective fields shaped by narratives, metaphors, and shared assumptions. This collective mind organizes attention, shapes norms, and guides the valuation of knowledge. Scientific revolutions are not only intellectual turnovers, they are social shifts in what a culture finds plausible and consequential. Theories succeed when they resonate with the cultural mood. They stall when they conflict with prevailing imagery. Therefore, to influence the course of human understanding, one must attend to collective imagination. Communicators, educators, and artists are as important as researchers in this task. The memes we propagate, the films we produce, the metaphors we normalize, all of these participate in an ecology of meaning that supports or undermines particular scientific agendas. Change occurs not only in laboratories, but in living rooms, classrooms, and public squares where narratives circulate and settle. Recognizing this is not manipulation, it is responsibility. If the collective mind becomes dominated by images of extraction, dominance, and short-term gain, our institutions will shape themselves accordingly. Conversely, if we cultivate narratives of reciprocity, interdependence, and long-term stewardship, our collective systems will begin to reflect those priorities. The emergence of any new science that meaningfully contributes to human well-being must therefore be accompanied by efforts to reshape public imagination. Practically, this requires cross-sector collaboration, scientists partnering with storytellers, policy makers learning from elders, and technologists listening to communities. It also means that education must become a practice of myth-making, teaching students to tell stories about the world that are generative rather than exploitative. When the story changes, the pattern of behavior changes too. We become, quite literally, what we tell ourselves. There are frontiers that cannot be crossed by microscopes or telescopes. They require methods tuned to first-person experience, disciplined introspection, carefully framed subjective reports, and protocols that cultivate reliable inner data. Such methods are not new. Contemplative traditions have developed them across centuries. What is new is the possibility of bringing these practices into conversation with contemporary research, creating hybrid protocols that respect the rigor of science while acknowledging the legitimacy of inner knowing. The modern scientist may be skeptical of introspection because it is notoriously variable. Yet variability is a feature, not a fatal flaw. If studied with care, it can reveal patterns of attention, affect, and transformation that correspond to measurable outcomes in behavior and health. Mindfulness research, for instance, has shown that disciplined inner practices produce robust physiological effects. The lesson is clear: inner experience is not epiphenomenal. It has causal efficacy. To cultivate an inner science, we need methodological creativity, blinded contemplative trials, intersubjective verification, and trained protocols for describing subjective states. We need academic cultures that reward such work rather than dismiss it out of hand. When we design such rigorous investigations, the results can be transformative: therapies that integrate narrative and neurobiology, educational programs that enhance moral imagination, and public health initiatives that leverage communal practices of meaning to support resilience. Ultimately, experiential science invites a moral reorientation. It teaches that the human interior is not a private luxury, but a public resource. Inner practices that strengthen empathy, attention, and moral imagination become civic goods. We are confronted, then, with a political question as much as a scientific one: what social infrastructures will we build to cultivate inner capacities at scale? The answer will shape the kind of world we create. The reconciliation of outer measure and inner meaning is not a retreat into relativism, nor a capitulation to mysticism. It is an evolution of knowledge toward integration. Imagine a culture in which instruments are complemented by rituals, where equations speak to narratives, and where laboratories have rooms for reflection and story. In such a culture, technologies are assessed not only for efficiency, but for their capacity to sustain meaning. Policies are judged not solely for GDP, but for their capacity to nourish inner life. This integrated mind is pragmatic and imaginative. It deploys empirical rigor where appropriate and symbolic literacy where necessary. It cultivates institutions that are flexible enough to learn from failure and humble enough to incorporate critique. Above all, it recognizes that progress is not simply accumulation, but maturation, the development of mature systems that care for both outer conditions and inner states. The practical steps are tangible interdisciplinary training, metrics that measure well-being and meaning alongside productivity, public rituals that re-enchant citizenship, and media that elevate symbolic competence. These measures are not utopian fantasies. They are policy decisions and cultural practices that can be implemented incrementally. As they accumulate, they will generate a different kind of prosperity, one that sees technological power as servant to purpose rather than its master. We stand, then, at a crossroads. We may continue on a path that prizes mastery of matter while neglecting the interior, or we may choose the harder, more gracious path of integration. The latter demands courage, the courage to be uncertain, to listen to symbol, to accept complexity, and to place meaning alongside measurement. If we choose that path, we begin to understand what, beyond science, truly means not an abandonment of reason, but a widening of reason until it can hold both the outer and the inner, the measurable and the memorable, the fact and the story. In that widening, human life discovers a new legibility, one that finally honors the full texture of existence.